Let's bring in Washington Post political reporter Eugene Scott. Eugene, you have called the president's attacks on Meghan Markle unhelpful, and you wrote about her absence from Trump's visit. For those who don't follow it closely, how significant is it that she's not around?
Well, it is significant in part because she is one of the most obvious ties and most recent well-known ties between America and Britain right now. She was born here in Los Angeles and now is a duchess. And so she's been very vocal, quite frankly, about politics and social issues and could honestly be a bridge between a president who is quite unpopular in Britain at the current time. But instead of addressing the valid concerns she had about his divisiveness and some of his worldviews and comments about women, he dismissed her in a way that he has dismissed Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth Warren, the mayor of San Juan, Puerto Rico, when they also point out that he is not as helpful as you would think the president of the United States would be.
But those are people who are involved in government and legislating. Meghan Markle just had a baby. It doesn't seem like she's out there doing loads of public appearances, and she's a member of the royal family. As far as politics and policy goes, does it really matter to the president? As ugly as we could say things are in the U.S., they're even worse in the U.K. You could argue they need President Trump's support more than he needs theirs.
Well, if it really had no meaning, if Meghan Markle's views of the president of the country of her birth were insignificant, one could argue that the president would not be taking so much time to meet with other royals. We know that she is not a legislator, but there is power and influence that she has beyond what happens in their versions of Capitol Hill and Congress. And so it wouldn't be unhelpful to form a positive relationship with Meghan Markle, or at least not to dismiss her. We know that she remains popular, and she could help people in her new adopted country have a better view of him if he somehow explained what he said or meant that she found troublesome in a way that she found helpful.
I want to ask you about the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. He was interviewed by Axios this weekend. Here's what he said about birtherism.
Was birtherism racist?
Look, I wasn't really involved in that.
I know you weren't. Mm-hmm. Was it racist?
Like I said, I wasn't involved in that.
I know you weren't.
Mm-hmm.
Was it racist?
Look, I know who the president is, and I have not seen anything in him that is racist. So again, I was not involved in that.
Did you wish he didn't do that?
Like I said, I was not involved in that. That was a long time ago.
It wasn't that long ago.
Jared Kushner was in Donald Trump and Ivanka Trump's life and orbit while Trump was still carrying on about birtherism. It wasn't all that long ago. So that's just incorrect that Jared Kushner says that he wasn't involved in it. But, Eugene, that wasn't a hard question.
It wasn't a hard question, and 2 points. Birtherism was revived during the 2016 presidential election, and we also saw Melania Trump speak out in support of her husband and his claims of birtherism. So I think a better question for Jared is, you were involved in the campaign. Why did you not speak out on it then? I think this response from Jared is why so many people believe that it's not just the president who traffics in racism, but it's the administration as a whole. Because what Jared could have said was that that was not an appropriate thing to do. He could have distanced himself from the comments and spoke about what he is actually doing to improve relationships with people of the Muslim faith and people who are not white. And he didn't do any of that.
No, he didn't. All right, Eugene. Thank you for that, Eugene Scott.
Allie, what Jared Kushner is basically saying, put all that stuff aside, look at all the good stuff he's doing, but he's unwilling to say this was bad stuff. He said the president isn't not racist for 69 years and then becomes a racist, completely omitting the fact that the president called for the execution of the Central Park Five.
It was a long time ago, yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Birtherism, again, was just 2 years ago. So for Jared to say that, I'm sorry, it's just too much. But he knows if you say something bad about this president, he will not forgive you and he will come out hitting, swinging, which is exactly why you knew he was going to say something bad about Meghan Markle or about the mayor of London. It's Melania Trump's words. If you hit him, he will hit back 5 times harder. That's how he rolls.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here. To watch the latest interviews and highlights, you can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.